Does it feel cool in here to you? We're good? Okay, just checking. I want to modify, as we begin this morning, I want to modify something that I said last week. One of the things I mentioned to you was that I have a helpmate that God has given me, perfectly designed for me, who is my first and favorite critic. And after the service last week, she said, you said something a little too strongly and too inaccurately, and I want to just modify that. I should have said that the Campbells are an example of outstanding missionaries. We have a lot of good missionaries, and I'm not the Lord. I can't ultimately judge and evaluate anyone else's ministry. And so I just want to clarify that we love and appreciate all of the people who serve as part of the family of Graceway Bible Church. And so that goes for those who are on the professional staff, for those who are serving as missionaries, as well as all of you in the various areas in which you serve. So hopefully I can just clarify and modify that a little bit. You'll allow me one oops occasionally, right? Okay. All right. We're working our way through the book of Revelation, and we come now to the very final section of the book. It's a section which deals with eternity, which deals with heaven. The scene changes as we move from chapter 20 into chapter 21. And we encounter now the events that will be the future for the body of Christ. We have seen in chapter 19 that the King is returning. Jesus is returning, and that he is conquering the earth, that he is the King of the earth, that the sword, the word which goes out of his mouth, destroys all of the enemies of the Lord. And we have the kingdom set up, this millennial kingdom in which Jesus will reign here on this earth, this renewed earth, for 1,000 years. It's a Jewish kingdom. He is the Jewish king. We come with him as the bride of the king. And so we will dwell with him in the capital city of Jerusalem. At the end of that millennial kingdom, we have one final rebellion that we saw at the end of chapter 20. Satan is released for a brief time. He leads a rebellion of folks who were born during the millennial kingdom, but who were never born again. They lived under the righteous authority of Jesus, his righteous rule. But when Satan was released and they're given an opportunity, they embrace the sin which is within their hearts still and rebel. And we have one final destruction, and then the heavens and the earth themselves are destroyed. And we saw from Peter's statement that this is going to happen as a result of Jesus speaking the words which dissolve the material elements from which our universe is made. And then we had the great white throne judgment right at the end of chapter 20. Jesus sits on this throne and judges all of those who are unbelievers. They're all brought back from the dead. They stand before Jesus. They're evaluated before him, and they are consigned then to the lake of fire. And so here is the end for Satan. Here is the end for all unbelievers, the end of all of the angels who followed Satan in his rebellion. And I'd like you to keep in your mind the three major characteristics of the lake of fire and the ultimate destiny of those who are unbelievers. They are eternal physical suffering, eternal suffocating darkness, and eternal solitary confinement. As we move now into these last two chapters, we raise the question, what is heaven like? And in some ways, you could simply answer the question by saying that heaven is the opposite of the lake of fire. That what we have are two total opposite ends of the spectrum, means of existence for the people who have lived and inhabited this earth. But that's not to say nearly enough. So we want to keep in mind this sense of opposites, this sense in terms of what is God saying to us about the future for those of us who are believers in Jesus and followers of him. We begin, as we move into chapter 21, with the statement that God's presence makes all things new. What's striking to me as we begin this study is that John says that he saw the new heavens and the new earth coming down out of heaven from God, but he is diverted from the city itself to the subject of God himself instead. We begin with the statement, John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. This new heaven and new earth are named to reflect, in my judgment, a one-to-one correspondence, a similarity to the realms in which we exist now. If it were not a new earth, God would not have called it a new earth. If he calls it a new earth, there's something about the new earth that corresponds to the present earth. So there is some aspect of the future. I personally think that when we get to heaven, when we stand in the presence of Jesus, when we experience these things, we're not going to be there saying, what I wouldn't give to go back to the earth to smell those lilacs in the spring one more time, or to be out in a boat fishing on the lake one more time, or whatever it is that excites you. So John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. He doesn't tell us everything about it, but he gives us some insight with regard to that. He says that the first earth and the first sea are gone. And we saw that at the end of the preceding chapter. They are disintegrated. They are burned up in a massive atomic fire as the atoms divide, as Jesus releases them. And all of the energy that was used by Jesus to maintain the material universe has been released. And that first heaven and earth are gone. So the material realm is gone. I believe that the realm that he goes on to describe is substantial, but not material. That is, it's real, it's tangible, but it's not made out of matter. Matter is not eternal. And the scientists tell us that the universe is running down. If it were allowed to run long enough, it would run out of steam. But this realm in which God is creating is a substantial realm. It's real. It's something that we can touch. It's something that we will experience, but it's not made out of matter, so it's not material. He adds also, interestingly enough, that there is no sea. And for me, that reflects the understanding of what happens early in the book of Genesis, when God was regretting the fact that he had made mankind, and he decided he was going to destroy the human race. And he was going to destroy through water, through a flood. And the Bible tells us that the heavens were opened and the fountains of the deep were opened, and that there is significantly more water on the surface of the earth now than there was before the flood. In my judgment, and I don't have a verse for this, but it appears as you read through the scriptures that God created the oceans and the mountains to provide separation when he spread people out on the earth to inhibit the fraternization, the socialization of mankind. Because where men and women gather in large quantities in the cities and so forth, we tend to have the exacerbation of crime and sin and all sorts of things. Where there is anonymity in that urban population as opposed to every man kind of knowing his neighbor in a country situation, that sin tends to be exacerbated. So God took his thumb and he dug the ditches for the Atlantic and the Pacific. And we have these huge bodies of water that have separated mankind for ages. John makes a statement here, with the new heavens and the new earth, there's no sea. And I think we go back to an earth that is similar to the earth that existed before the flood. I don't have a verse, but it seems to me that before the flood, men literally could walk around the face of the earth. That you could transverse the earth, which was a tropical, semi-tropical climate all over the face of the earth. The earth was enclosed in a ball of water that acted like insulation, so that the temperatures were not extreme as they are now. In other words, there was no North Pole and South Pole ice caps and so forth prior to the flood. But with the removal of that canopy of water, what you have then is more difference in temperatures. That's all created, best I can tell, from the flood. At any rate, whether you go there or not, he makes a statement there's no sea any longer. And so it's a curious statement unless it is somehow related to the ability of mankind to walk on the earth and to navigate this new creation which God is making. He goes on to add then that New Jerusalem descends from God to the earth. And I take it that this New Jerusalem, artists have tried to picture it, and it's very difficult for us to picture, except that we're told that this New Jerusalem descends out of heaven to this new earth. And we're going to be told more as we come along next week about the dimensions and the design and so forth of this New Jerusalem. But it's a place that God already has. John says, I saw it descend from heaven to this new earth. And this New Jerusalem occupies the new earth which God has created. It's a place, it seems to me, that Jesus is talking about in John chapter 14 when he says, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And so this is what Jesus is working on. This is what he is preparing for you and me. And once the present heavens and earth are destroyed and this new heaven and earth are created, then this city which God is preparing, which is a celestial city. Again, it's not made out of matter, but John uses material things to describe it because that's the only concept that we have. And so he describes this city for us. But he moves quickly away from that in this first little section of the book, of this chapter. He moves on to describe that God tabernacles among us. He says now, beginning in verse 3, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, the tabernacle of God is among men. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read these verses, my eye is first kind of drawn to the city. I want to know about the city. I want to know about this New Jerusalem. But John is quickly diverted from that to focus on the fact that God is tabernacling among men. And I think that's the first, that's the first characteristic of heaven, is that God's presence is what pervades everything. And so he makes the statement and he repeats it. Notice how he repeats it. He says, the tabernacle of God is among men. He will dwell among them. That's redundant unless it's there for emphasis. And they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And so we have, and so we have a second time the fact that this statement is made, or actually three times, that God is going to dwell among mankind. John's trying to make a point for us that God is going to be dwelling with us. He goes on to add, as he makes that statement that God is dwelling with us, that there are certain things that will no longer exist then. He points out that with God dwelling among us, the first things are abolished. And so you have to ask yourself the question, what do you mean by first things? And he gives us some examples here. He says, first of all, that tears are removed. And so it seems to me that what he's saying, when tears are removed, that we will have a whole different perspective on life. We have all done things, or we have all experienced things that have brought tears to us. Things that we have cried over, things that we've really been hurt over. And so if we're going to be in heaven and there are no more tears, then we're going to have to look at life completely differently. So the presence of God is going to bring to you and me a different perspective. Things that we might be agonizing over otherwise are now going to be seen from his perspective, are now going to be seen from a whole different point of view. And so all the tears will be wiped away. Imagine that. There's nothing else for eternity that causes heartache, that causes tears. That's unbelievable. I mean, we've lived with that most of our lives. Sometimes as youngsters growing up, we're kind of sheltered from those things, right? Our parents don't usually put those burdens on us. But as soon as you start to move into the realms of life where we have interaction with other people and so on, we get our feelings hurt. We get insulted. We get all kinds of things that happen to us. And so we have tears that come. He goes on to add that death is removed. And so there is a whole set of new expectations, a whole new outlook on life. I think it's difficult for us to imagine an existence where there are no tears and there is no death. Because it has been part of what we are and who we are forever. Some of us have lost loved ones at very young ages. Some of us are still hurting and struggling with the loss of loved ones. Some of us are still hurting over insults and problems and difficulties that have occurred along the way. He goes on to add that toil is removed. It says pain in the translation that we have. It says there will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The word pain is toil here. It's interesting. It's the same word that's used all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. It's a Hebrew word back there, but the same concept that the toil, the hardship that came upon ladies in the childbearing and the toil and hardship that came upon men in working and earning a living is gone. There's no more frustration. There's no more hardship or difficulty in terms of what we will experience. And that comes about because God is in our presence in a whole new way. So it seems to me that life, eternal life, is the opposite of number 3 in our list for the lake of fire. There, number 3 was eternal solitary confinement. And what we have in heaven is eternal godly companionship. And not only is it eternal godly companionship, but it's eternal companionship with those who've gone on before us. Both friends and relatives of ours, and also those who have lived in many generations down through the course of human history who are believers in the Lord. Remember when Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and Elijah? They were talking and conversing together. They're real people. When Jesus spoke to the Pharisees and the Sadducees who didn't believe in the resurrection, he talked about how God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but is. When the beggar man dies in Luke chapter 16, he's carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. And so what we have is a reference to fellowship. We were created in the image of God to be social, fellowshipping creatures. Now, every once in a while, we like to be alone. I like to be alone, get off alone and enjoy alone time. And we all have some of that. And sometimes there are people around us that really bug us, right? And so I can see some of you are thinking, I don't know, I want to be in heaven with her forever, right? Except that you're going to have all of those warts and foibles and so forth removed. And so will she. Okay? And so we're going to be together in glory, and we're going to be together with people who know us, people who love us, because God is in our midst, because he has finished the work of conforming us to the image of his Son, because he has brought us to the perfection which we now lack. It doesn't matter how long you've known the Lord, you still have some idiosyncrasies, we'll put it nicely, right? You still have some characteristics of the flesh, of the old nature. But the work is going to be finished. You're going to like me in heaven. We're going to like each other. We're going to love each other. We're going to be together because God is superintending that. See, as people who were created for togetherness, we were created in the image of God. And God is an eternal togetherness. He's an eternal Trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have loved each other and fellowshiped with each other and lived with each other forever. And you and I are going to enter into that. And that's going to be awesome for us. So the presence of heaven makes all things new. All of these things that we have struggled with are going to pass away. It's hard to wrap our minds around that because we're so much into this realm. And we have lived with the specter of death forever. Shakespeare put it this way. He comments on this in a number of ways in the course of his writings. In Romeo and Juliet, he says, "Death is my son-in-law, death is my heir. My daughter he hath wedded, I will die and leave him all. Life, living, all is death's." He recognized that all of life is influenced by death. Our grandchildren were away a week or so ago, and we received some pictures of them jumping off the dock into a lake. And Grandmom right away was concerned. Are there snakes in the lake? Are there alligators in the lake? Are there rocks in the lake? All of life is colored by that sort of thing, isn't it? I mean, you go into a restaurant and you say, is it okay to eat here? Right? Some of us are much more sensitive than others to certain things. And so we have learned along the way what you can do and what you can't do. You go for a walk and you sometimes evaluate whether it's safe to do that. Is it safe to ride a motorcycle? We have to evaluate everything that we do in this life. Woody Allen put it a different way. Woody Allen said, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens." Right? All of life is affected by the fact that we are mortal, by the fact that we're going to die. And we don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know how. I saw a thing on TV yesterday where somebody went into the hospital for a minor surgery, and that person is suffering for the rest of his life because of that. We live with that kind of stuff. And we want to sue and we want to correct it and all that, and maybe that's okay on some occasions, I don't know. But it's just a matter of us learning that we live in a world that is characterized by death. So, what we understand now in this next section is that God's presence makes all things life. Not just new, but life. All right? We read these words. He who sits on the throne said, "Behold, I'm making all things new." So God is going to make all things new. The old things are passed away, all things become new, And we read that the whole orientation of our existence is going to change. We don't ever think about death again. Death is separation. It's separation of the soul and spirit from the body. It is, in the spiritual realm, separation of one person from another. Separation from God, separation from each other when death occurs. And we struggle with that. We wrestle with that in this life. But God says, I'm making all things new. Write these words, for they are faithful and true. And so he's saying, I want you to listen to me here. I want you to bank on this. I am going to change all about how you think and how you exist. I am Alpha and Omega. I am the beginning and the end. I am the sovereign one. I was here at the very beginning. I'll be here at the end. I am the one who is in control of all things, and I am making adjustments for your future. It's going to be very different from what it is now. Imagine how confining life must feel to a 9-month fetus. So tight a space. And mothers give testimony to babies trying to move in the womb and so forth. I think it's like that for us. Especially as we come down to the end of our lives, we have had a lot of experience. We've had a lot of pain and suffering. We've had a lot of disappointment in life. Not because anybody is against you. It's because of the realm in which we live. It's because this is a fallen world. Because nothing is perfect this side of the Lord himself. Nothing is perfect this side of heaven. And the longer you live, the more disappointments you rack up. I'm not a pessimist. I'm not saying that we all ought to go around doom and gloom. I think we ought to be happy and excited and looking forward to the potential. But it's a reality, isn't it? It's a reality that my muscles aren't as strong as they used to be. My mind is not quite as sharp as it used to be. Or whatever. As we go through the difficulties of life, and we look back and we see that it's filled with these kinds of struggles. And we feel a little bit, I think, like this baby in the womb must feel. Cramped and struggling, wanting to break free, wanting to have a whole new level of life. And God says that's what's going to happen. That life is going to swallow up mortality. Paul makes that statement, and we'll look at it more in a second, but he makes that statement in 2 Corinthians when he talks about the fact that we're going to lay down this tent and we're going to pick up a new tent. Here's how God says it through John in chapter 21 here. God says, and this is God speaking, I will give life to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost. I will give to the one who thirsts. Are you thirsty for life? Are you desirous of having this existence that goes way beyond where we are now? Of looking forward to the time that you will be together with loved ones and with Jesus? And that you will be free of the frailties and the difficulties and the hardships of this life? Of course we are. Now, that doesn't mean we walk around with our jaw dragging on the ground all the time. We seek to enjoy what God has given. The Bible teaches us that we ought to experience joy and fulfillment and be grateful and be gracious in the course of events. But we're looking forward to something beyond that. As we've said, all of this life is governed by mortality, but God at this point is going to give us the water of life abundantly, freely. What is he saying? He's saying that we're going to experience life like we have never experienced it. That this union with God and the union with others who've gone on before us is going to bring us a tremendous sense of fulfillment and blessing in this life. I think what he's saying is that this divine sonship is going to be recognized. He says, he who overcomes will inherit these things. I will be his God, and he will be my son. And so we're going to be brought into a relationship with Jesus. He is the firstborn among many brethren. And so it's God's intent and desire, and has been throughout all of the ages, that you and I would enter into a fullness of fellowship with him that will bring to us this fullness of life. It'll bring to us an enthusiasm, an excitement, a joy in the presence of the life-giving God himself. And so the words of Paul, when he says that mortality will be swallowed up by life, are the same thing that John is saying here as he portrays this divine life as the opposite of the second death. That's why he makes a statement here, I think. He says, but for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and so forth, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So those who have no faith in Jesus, those who are not born again, will experience this separation. They will experience the eternal isolation, not only from God, but from everyone else. It will be eternal, solitary confinement. When God has made us to be interpersonal beings. And so this is the design. By contrast, God is going to give to us all of that interpersonal relationship that comes from his own very being. And so that's what he wants for us. Paul put it this way. He says, while we're in this tent, speaking of our lives right now, we groan and are burdened because we do not wish to be unclothed. Nobody really wants to die, but to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Swallowed up, overwhelmed, totally inundated with life. That's beyond our comprehension at this point. To enter into life that knows no limits, no specter hanging over it, no tears, no mourning, no distance, no separation, no hardship, no insults, none of the kinds of things that we have to live with in this existence. We're going to move into the very presence of God, and he's going to superintend that. And he's going to just keep giving us the water of life. He's going to keep fueling that life because he himself is life. We're going to see next week that the water of the river of the water of life comes directly out of the throne of God, indicating that he is the one who provides life. And so that which is mortal, that which we experience now, is going to be totally swallowed up by life. Third thing he says is that God's house makes all things beautiful. I would even add the word exquisite at this point. John says, tells us at this point that one of the seven angels that we met back in chapter 15 and 16, one of those seven angels comes to him and says, come, I will show you the bride. And so he's going to show John the bride. But there's a little switcheroo that's pulled at this point because there is no bride exactly. Instead, what the text tells us is that John is shown the New Jerusalem. He says, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. So he's very specific. It's not a vague reference. It's the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And we were introduced to her back in chapter 19. That's the church. And then he adds, he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down from heaven. So he says, I'm going to show you the bride. And what he showed him is the city, Jerusalem. And then he begins to describe the city, Jerusalem. What he's saying is this, that the Jerusalem, this new Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven, this place that God is preparing in his presence right now, that's coming to this new earth, is where you and I are going to live. It's our eternal existence, this new Jerusalem. It's the bride. And I think what he's saying is it's the home of the bride. And he describes then something about this dwelling place for the bride. Jesus said, as I said earlier, in my Father's house are many dwelling places, many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you. And now this city settles out of the presence of God, the throne room of God, wherever it exists currently, and it comes down to the new earth, which God creates. And then he goes on to describe this. This new residence is exquisitely beautiful. Her brilliance was like a costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. Now, the stones that are used here, like in a lot of places in the scriptures, are not clearly identified for us. There's a lot of debate if you read the commentary. Some people say when he says crystal clear jasper, he's really talking about a diamond which is clear. Others say that crystal clear is really crystal shining jasper. And a jasper is a red or yellowish stone, a gemstone, polished highly so that it glistens and shines. The answer is we don't know exactly. The answer is John is trying to describe something which is total otherworldly. He's trying to describe something which is beyond our ability to grasp, and he uses some of the imagery that's available to him. And so we have this crystal clear jasper. It may be polished stones. It may be clear. It may be something that John is trying to bring together, the idea of a diamond and a jasper in one. They have chocolate diamonds now. Right? Have you seen them? Do you like them? Some of the ladies are saying, I like all diamonds. Right? I don't care what color they are. Somehow chocolate and diamond does not go together for me. Give me chocolate or give me diamonds, but, chocolate diamond, I don't know. I don't know what a crystal clear jasper is ultimately. But John is describing it in a way that speaks to its brilliance and its glory. There's a great and high wall, we'll look at it more next week, with 12 gates. And each gate has the name of one of the tribes of Israel on it. And then the wall has 12 foundation stones, and each level of foundation stone has a name of one of the apostles on it. I think what he's doing is he's trying to describe for us the glory and the grandeur of what he sees. And I said to myself, what are some of the most beautiful homes on earth? If you were to go to the computer, we can do lots of things nowadays with Google, right? You go to the computer and you say, show me the most beautiful homes in the world. And these are some of the things that come up. Now, heaven, this isn't going to hold a candle to heaven. But it's a beautiful home. Or this one. Or this one. Or this one. They tell me this is a $135 million home in Aspen, Colorado. And it's a shack. I wouldn't live there in heaven. Right? You got to think a whole new level, right? Got to think a whole new level. And so I show you these only to say that the most we can do on this earth, if you left that for 5 years and nobody touched it, you know what would happen to it? Start to fall down, right? Weeds would come up all over the place. And some of you would go in there and say, I'll offer you a little bit for it and fix it up or whatever. I don't know. Here's the bottom line. God's presence invigorates life eternally. God's presence, that's the key. And presence with God is life, but presence with God is going to invigorate life. It's going to give us life like we have never, ever known and experienced. And so we need to think along those levels as we experience that. This earthly life is just a shadow. Could you imagine trying to explain Disney World to somebody who's never seen it and never been there? And you would say, well, they have rides. Well, we have rides here, right? You try to describe something that somebody has never seen. Well, that's what we're trying to do. John is trying to help us get a handle on these kind of things. I think we need to, secondly, put God first in everything. Because when we get there, it's not going to be about me. It's not going to be about my desires. It's not going to be about, well, you know, I'd like to live on a different street, or I'd like to live with somebody different, or whatever. It's going to be what God has in store. He is going to be the center of our relationships. And we need to pursue that now. Otherwise, you and I will be in for a rude awakening when we step on heaven's shores, if we don't put him first now. So that means working at getting rid of our idiosyncrasies. It means working to learn to live with God's people. It means working to put your own interests and your own preferences aside and to focus like Jesus did on the interests of others. Because that's what heaven's going to be like when we get there. And then thirdly, you want to share this place with everybody. Because you don't want anybody going in the opposite direction. Father, help us as we try to wrap our minds around this. It is way beyond us.